Samsung's best, the Galaxy S6 Edge Plus. We've got LG's best, the LG G4, and we put them up against Apple's best, the iPhone 6s Plus.
Yeah, I brought these out and I put them in a bunch of different situations: low light, macro, portrait, landscape, basically everything that you'd want these cameras to succeed in.
So first, we've got a macro image here. This is a beautiful flower. And this image is really bright and vibrant, but there's some real issues here. And namely, you don't really see them until you look closely, but it's actually out of focus. And we found this to be a pretty common situation with the iPhone, right?
Focusing up close with the iPhone is not necessarily the easiest thing to do. You have to give yourself more space than I think most people would expect. And even tapping to focus here didn't really help. And then on top of that, you take another look at some of the colors here. These flowers, as we're actually going to see, are white around the edges, but the iPhone really kind of bled that color throughout, and you lose a lot of depth of the color. So let's take a look at LG's version of this.
Obviously, it looks like a totally different photo.
It's a totally different photo, much more in focus, but it's also a lot duller. We don't get as much of the pink here in the center of the flower as we did with the iPhone. And then we take a look at Samsung's, and Samsung's basically splits the difference between those two. It's sharp. We can see all the way down into this flower over here, but it's also still very separated from the background, so you get this really awesome depth. And there's a lot of color. I mean, we're seeing dark pinks in here that we weren't seeing in the iPhone, and we're seeing white, really, really light pink out here at the edges that we weren't seeing in the iPhone. So, I mean, color depth, actual depth, clarity, this one definitely beat out all the others.
Yeah, I agree. There's some weirdness going on around the edges here. It looks like it may be a little over sharpened, but it doesn't take away from the photo at all. I think that by far Samsung won this one hands down.
So next photo we're going to look at is one just right from the corner of Central Park. We've got some flowers and trees and stuff in the front, nice landscape with some buildings in the background, a lot of different competing light, highlights and shadows. What do you think we got
Well,
here?
the first thing I'm noticing here is that where we saw the sharpening wasn't really a problem on Samsung's image of the flower, here it's kind of a mess. You lose a lot of detail in the center here and a lot of detail around the edges because Samsung's kind of over sharpening. And that's kind of counterintuitive to what most people want or think. You want a really sharp image, but when you apply it artificially, it can look really bad. If we flip over to what the iPhone did, you can see everything is just more pleasant to the eye. It's not as harsh to look at. There's more detail preserved in this area. It's not blown out, and the image doesn't look as overly crisp to my eyes.
This is way less aggressive of an image, just from the highlights to the shadows to that sharpening detail, and that's what Samsung's phones seem to do. This when there's a lot going on in a photo, that's when their sharpening is kind of exposed. If it's a nice, simpler shot like that flower, it's nice to sharpen it up a little bit. It doesn't have a lot of stuff to play with, but in a really busy photo like this, we can see that Samsung's phones kind of overdo it a little bit. But yeah, this is really pleasant all the way to the shadows in this building.
Yeah.
You can see these leaves in the dark up here, but without blowing out these flowers. This is just like exactly what you'd want to take away from that setting.
The iPhone did a really impressive job here. Over here on LG, I can't say the same. You've got blown out highlights here. The image just kind of looks just harsh to my eyes. It's kind of got a lot of the similar sharpening issues as the Samsung, and the busy details here just make it unpleasant to look at, unfortunately. So here we've got a pretty standard, straightforward portrait. It's head and shoulders, very common shot. We're outdoors in daylight here. This particular image is from the iPhone, and for the most part, it's pretty good. There's plenty of detail here. You got detail in her eyes and her eyelashes, down to her hair. The color is a little weird, though. It's kind of got this green cast, which we saw a lot with the iPhone photos, and it becomes really dramatic when we check out the other photos from LG and Samsung. Color's way more natural here.
Yeah, you can really see it in her skin and definitely in the hair over here. It's kind of borrowing some of the blue from the background here, but the green cast, when you really pull back and look at some of the other pictures, is what stands out here. And we saw that in a couple of the other iPhone photos that we were taking. It tended to, if it got the colors wrong, it got them wrong green, and that's not really a great color to let bleed into pictures that shouldn't have green in them.
Especially if it's a portrait.
Yeah, it's just going to it makes the face look, a little sicklier. So otherwise, it's not bad. We've got some great detail here, not too much compression or anything. But one thing we did notice is that it sounds like there's not a big difference in the apertures between the iPhone and the other phones.
Right.
iPhone has a f2.2 aperture, and the Samsung has f1.9, and the LG has an f1.8 lens. And that sounds really close, but it actually makes a pretty big difference. Here she looks compressed against the wall, almost everything's in detail or in focus. But you look at LG and the Samsung image, and there's some separation there between her and the wall. There's some depth in this image, and that little change in aperture actually makes a really big difference in a picture like this, at least, when you're close to the subject.
I think the Samsung did the best job here as far as balancing the color, the sharpness, and the saturation. What's interesting, though, is the LG is a really kind of almost a desaturated or flat image, which isn't great for a directly out of camera image, but if you want to edit your photos or something like that after the fact, this gives you a good base to work with.
Yeah, I look at a photo like this and I think about like all the different directions I could take it when I'm editing a picture. Right. Whereas I look at something like the one that we got out of the S6 Edge Plus and I say, you know, this one's probably already good enough to post somewhere. I don't really need to do too much to it. So that's really kind of a matter of choice. But I think most people are going to want to do less out of the camera and would like something like this. So we just took a look at a portrait image taken in daylight. Let's take a look at something on the far end of the spectrum taken at nighttime, lit by a phone screen. And we can see here, this is the iPhone image. We can see that green cast again, a lot of green color in his face, especially where it falls off from light to shadow. And then we also see that the iPhone didn't really handle the exposure too well. It's really blowing out some highlights here around his nose and his forehead up here. So not really the best thing, but you got a usable image. This is a really challenging moment to get a picture. It was really dark out, even though you can still see a little bit of blue in the sky.
It's not bad. It kind of reminds me of when you had a disposable camera and you took a picture with a flash. It's a little harsh, and it's got that green tint, whereas you can see if we flip over to what Samsung did, it's kind of like the exact opposite. Yeah. All the green has been replaced by this orangey yellow, which is way too extreme in this case, and I really dislike this image a lot. The other problems that I have with this image is it's way oversaturated. The green is super green, the red is super red, and even though it looks like there's more detail in some of the areas where the iPhone blew it out, you can tell it's just smeared, and there's no actual detail there. So it's really interesting how the two cameras handle this similar situation differently. And really the winner, I think, here is the LG. You've got all the detail in his face as best as you can preserve it. His shirt is not too oversaturated, and it's not overexposed or green.
This is like the perfect blend of enough sharpening to get some detail out of the image, enough noise reduction so that it doesn't look completely awful. And I think a lot of this is also due to the optical image stabilization on the LG G4. All of these phones have optical image stabilization, which is great and helps especially in low light situations where you need a longer exposure. But LG's is definitely in a different class from the other two phones. I mean, you can hold this phone and kind of rock it around a little bit up and down, and the image won't move on the screen. It's almost disorienting. So for a picture like this, where you need to be holding the phone there for the shutter to open a little bit longer to capture the image, the optical image stabilization on the LG really helped make this the best picture of the three.
Yeah, I agree.